Chapter 4 Slavery, Freedom, and the Struggle for the Empire, 217-63. The Caribbean is going to continue to be Great Britain's commercial center. It's kind of the crown jewel of their trading revenue producing area. And part of it's because it's something called a triangular trade. For instance, a shipload will leave Africa full of slaves and go to the New World or the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, they will sell their slaves and purchase molasses and agricultural goods. Then the ship will sail to New England, where the molasses will be turned into rum and the agricultural goods will be exchanged for manufactured goods. And the ship will go from New England back to Africa with the rum and manufactured goods and then trade them in for more slaves. So the triangular trade is Africa, the Caribbean, New England, back to Africa. And even though they don't want to admit it, the merchants from New York and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, they participated in and profited from the slave trade. No, they may not have dirtied their hands by actually selling a slave, but they either furnished the money for someone else to buy it, they furnished the ships, they furnished insurance. They participated and profited because the slave trade was extremely lucrative. And in Great Britain, it caused an increase in the growth of cities like Liverpool and Bristol, which were port cities, and increased the growth of banking and shipbuilding and insurance. And so you can say without fear of anyone doubting it, that the Industrial Revolution and the financial growth of Europe, as well as the New World, was on the back of the black slave. This is basically just a map. I mean, this big hump in Africa, the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, these were called that because that's where you got the slaves, that's where you found the gold, that's where you found the ivory. And so we would pick up slaves on the Slave Coast and we'd ship them over to the Caribbean where they would be seasoned, if you would, traded for molasses, excuse me, molasses and agricultural goods, and they would go to New England. Now, where's my cursor? To New England. But again, you make a trade back to the New World. So you've got Africa, Caribbean, New England, back to Africa again. Very lucrative. You had some that would go different places, but for the most part, no. Just those three places. And the Africans are going to actually become a rather large purchaser of manufactured goods. You're making money in the slave trade. And as I pointed out last chapter, the original slaves were sold to the Portuguese by Africans themselves. And in all honesty, the first slaves that were sold were prisoners of war or people who were in prison because of, not in prison, but who had been enslaved because of a debt. But with the demand increasing and the supply dwindling, the African seller had no choice but to go inland and raid villages and kidnap men, women, and children and bring them back to the coast to sell. That was the first leg of their journey. The second leg was called the Middle Passage. Men, women, children, dominantly men, because in the beginning, well, they devastated Africa because they took only the healthiest, strongest males because they made the best slaves. But you take the healthiest and strongest males or females out of any situation, and your demographics are going to change decidedly downward. But these people were shackled together. They had to lay in their own human waste. It was hot. There was no air movement. They couldn't move. Now, this, of course, is not an actual photograph. It's a pen and ink drawing showing you how closely they were laid end to end, so to speak. I mean, the ship's captain thought of the slaves as a commodity. And, of course, the commodity had to be packed as tightly as possible to make a profit. And of course, they had to be let on deck occasionally to get some fresh air because they had to take time to split out down below. And with no fresh air, they're going to die of starvation and heat prostration and disease. And sometimes you were executed, and sometimes you just plain committed suicide. And of course, you'd be brought up on deck to dance and exercise. Now, if you were an attractive young woman, they were dancing for the entertainment of the crew, not for exercise. And if you refused, you could be whipped, or in the worst cases, you could just be tossed overboard. Here again is just another depiction of how tightly they were packed, just like sardines. The pen and ink on the right is showing the white overseer standing up and watching the slaves do their work. But by the mid of the 18th century, we're beginning to see distinct slave systems in British North America. And I stress British North America as opposed to the Caribbean and Portuguese South America. You got the tobacco-based plantation slavery in the Chesapeake area. You got the rice-based plantation slavery in South Carolina and Georgia. You got the non-plantation slavery in New England and the middle colonies. Carolina, yes, the colony was started with slave labor, but they tried to incorporate the Indians into working for them. And of course, they're exporting also deer skins and furs. And some of the Indians, like the Creeks, well, you know, we've got some prisoners of war we can sell to the British or the South Carolinians to work as slaves. And so they did this. And if they ran out of slaves, they just went to a neighboring tribe and captured some. But pretty soon, the Creeks, as well as some of the other Indians, got to thinking, you know, maybe this is not such a good idea. What if the Carolinians decide to use us for slaves? Maybe we better get out of sight, you know, out of mind, so to speak. So I've got rebels, but they didn't really rebel. They just stopped doing it and kind of melted back into the forest. And once they did that, the South Carolina colonists had, well, they had to turn elsewhere for their labor force. And of course, we know where that was. But with all the rice cultivation in the low country, we have to have more and more workers. So you import more and more slaves. And the more and more black slaves that came in, the racial divide is getting a little bit, shall we say, further and further apart. And despite all the terrible working conditions, some of the slaves were able to build a decidedly African American culture. The colony of Georgia, of course, was the last one that was established. And it was established mainly as a buffer between Spanish Florida and the profitable colony of South Carolina. But it was also going to be a place for debtors and for people who didn't have jobs in England, a place to dump them. And they had some very rigid rules. You couldn't have a slave in Georgia. You couldn't have any alcohol. You were only entitled to have 50 acres of land, and you couldn't sell it. They tried growing grapes. They tried growing rice. They even imported some silkworms and tried to grow silk. Nothing they tried worked. And the people that are there are looking to the north and seeing how profitable South Carolina is, and they're very unhappy. And in less than 20 years, the colony was not profitable at all. So the king pulls a charter and reverses all the rules. Yeah, you can have slaves. Now you can have alcohol. Now you can own more than 50 acres and you can sell it. And within a very short period of time, Georgia starts to resemble South Carolina with her large rice plantations and basically supporting a very wealthy planter class that's going to dominate the colony much as it does in just a little bit north. But now in New England and the middle colonies, even small farms, slavery was not really needed. People had big families and they had small farms. They could take care of it themselves. Slaves were a very small percentage of the population, and even in the wealthy families that owned slaves, they rarely owned more than one, and that one usually worked as a personal servant. Yes, there were some slaves working on the farm and some in the artisan shops, but mostly on the docks. Even though some worked on the docks, most of the ones worked on the docks were the free blacks. Slaves in the north did have a few, and I've got few italicized, a few more legal rights than the southern counterparts. In New England, for instance, the slave could not be severely physically punished. They could actually bring suits in the court of law, and their marriages were recognized. Yes, there were a large number of slaves, not large, I'd say significant number of slaves in New York and Philadelphia, but in the time period right before the Revolution, we're going from slave labor to more wage labor. Whether it's from morality or because they're being pushed by the abolitionists, we don't know, but we just know that there was a big gentle turning there. Now, this particular little chart is in your text, and it's just showing you the percentage of the slave population, the amount of slaves and the percentage. And of course, Virginia is the one that's got the highest. It's 42%. That's not the highest percentage. That's the highest number, 187,000. Whereas, but South and North Carolina have higher percentages of population, although they had a less smaller amount. But our population was smaller. So even though we had less than 750,000, it's still, in South Carolina, it's over 61% of our population is African American. And the Africans that are here, the slaves that are here, they're not the same ones that were here, 100 years ago. Those were imported. We have a few that are being imported, but for the most part, they're pretty much being born here. And repeating for another reason, you've got the distinct different slave systems, like the Chesapeake Bay area. You've got a much healthier climate than you have down in New Orleans and Louisiana, and in the rice plantations of South Carolina. You have a much more balanced sex ratio between male and female, and the African Americans there are continually exposed to white culture, so they're going to be more assimilating than they are developing their own. But in South Carolina and Georgia, you have very harsh working conditions. They operate under mostly the task system, where the plantation owner probably wouldn't even be out there in the fields. I mean, he'll tell them what to do, and once that job is done, they have free time and have very little contact with the white culture, so they start having their own, shall we say, culture is going to develop, and even though the birth rate is low. In the North, you have a much smaller population of African Americans, and they're assimilating into the white culture more than anything else, so culture there is going to develop even less rapidly than it did in the Chesapeake Bay area. Now, it didn't matter whether you were in the Chesapeake Bay area, whether you were in the Northeast or whether you were South. You're not going to always say, oh, I'm a slave, I'm just going to be a slave. You're going to have some form of resistance. You've got passive and you've got active. Passive resistance is, I said more to appease yourself. And an example of that would be you spit in your master's food. Now, this is not going to make him sick. It's not going to do anything to hurt him. He's not even going to know about it. You are going to know that that man sitting there is eating your spit. No real harm. It just makes you feel better. You could pretend not to understand directions or work real slow. Do things that are not going to get you punished, but that resistance a little bit for your own peace of mind. And of course, then there's the active resistance, which are riots and rebellions. And did they happen? Yes, but they were rare. It usually caused more problem in the long run than anything accomplished, because there's more white people out there and there's more arms out there than there is black. But things did happen. And one of the first, I guess you'd say, riots that occurred was in New York in 1712. And here again, we do not have any accounting from the slaves. We only have the white population's version. And it said a group of slaves burned some buildings and killed some whites who showed up to put out the fires. Well, of course, it didn't take long to quell this little rebellion, and they believed in that the punishment should fit the crime. So if you burned a building down, then you should be burned alive, which is what they did. Imperial wars in the 1730s and 40s are going to open the door for slave resistance, because you're going to get preoccupied doing other things. And of course, we have that rebellion in the West Indies in the last part of the 1700s. Wars that involve the colonies. Now, Bacon's Rebellion and Jake and Leisler are homegrown, if you would. The War of Jenkins' Ear, King George's War, the 7 Years' War, Queen Anne's War. These are all wars that have started basically overseas because of, believe it or not, the 7 Years' War and the War of Jenkins' Ear are basically a continuation of the War of the Austrian Succession. It's just ridiculous. The Peacock War and King William's War, they are basically wars of the Indians. I said, enough's enough. I'm tired of the white man taking my land, and they fight back and they lose. Bacon's Rebellion, I don't recall how much detail it went into in your text, but it was basically led by an Englishman against the governor of Jamestown because they wouldn't let him kill Indians. Jacob Leisler was a German immigrant who tried to do the right thing, and he did do a good thing, but he wound up getting hand-drawn and quartered because of it. The War of Jenkins' Ear, we're going to get into just in a minute, and King George and the 7 Years' War and Queen Anne's War, of course, are directly related to wars in Europe. Okay, the War of Jenkins' Ear. Now, Spain had this policy where their colonies could not trade with anybody but them. But occasionally, some of your Spanish colonies might want some French wine or maybe some English wool, so they would trade. But if you got caught trading, the punishment was usually death. Now, Captain Jenkins is an English merchant, shipper, and he's trading with the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, and he gets caught. Well, for some reason, the Spanish didn't kill him. Excuse me. They confiscated his ship and his goods and cut off his ear and turned him loose. And he kind of disappears for about a decade. Meanwhile, England and Spain are at it again, and primarily, believe it or not, over the war of the who's going to take the throne in Austria. England stops right below Georgia, and Spain takes over for Spanish Florida. Spain issued the statement that any slave that wanted to escape and come to Spanish Florida would be welcomed as a free man. So we begin to see, especially the colonies down around there, Georgia and South Carolina and in that area, they would run away to the south. Now, if you were a slave in Kentucky or Tennessee or maybe North Carolina, you wouldn't go that far south, you would go north. Excuse me, I think I need another cup of coffee. Mr. Jenkins, or Captain Jenkins, showed up in England and made his way into Parliament, and he's waving around this black piece of flesh, saying that it's his ear that the Spanish have cut off, and he's urging the English Parliament to declare war on Spain. So while all this is going on, a little place called Charleston, South Carolina, we have only the white plantation owner and the militia's accounts. We have no accounts from slaves. There was a group of 20 Angolan slaves that had not been here too long that decided they were going to run away from the plantation and they were going to run to the south to Spanish Florida. But they knew that they needed supplies. So there was a warehouse owned by a white man that they were going to raid the warehouse Sunday night. So these 20 men, about 11:31 Sunday night, break into the warehouse. And they're going to rob of guns and ammunition and food. But the owner of the warehouse and his foreman were there, so they were killed. Now, be that as it may, they robbed the warehouse, they killed these men, and they started heading south. And Stono River is just a little bit south and west of Charleston. Now, along the way, they're raiding other plantations, and they're killing all the white people they can find, and they pick up other slaves. They come to one plantation, and the slave liked his master, so he hit his master so they couldn't be killed. And actually, after it was all over with, he was given his freedom, but that's a different story. And they go into town, and they raid this tavern. Well, they didn't kill the tavern owner, even though he was white, because he had a reputation for being good to his slaves. But they did take all of his liquor and goods. Well, meanwhile, the militia finds out about it, and they start rounding each other up. Now, this started about 11:30 on Sunday night, but by Monday mid-morning, the militia finds them sitting in a clearing about 20 miles south of Charleston, pretty much drunk on their butts. But they did fight back, and they fought rather well. There was a bunch of them killed. Some of them got away. But dozens were killed, and whites and black. And, of course, it's a foregone conclusion that the Stono Rebellion is going to be crushed. So what was the result? Other than the deaths on both sides, it scared the hell out of a lot of plantation owners, especially with the Angola slaves being the way they were. And all they did was lead to extremely tightening and harsh slave code laws. And it wasn't just in Carolina, it spread to Georgia and North Carolina too. I mean, everybody's thinking, oh, we can't have this happen. Any little freedoms that the black man had had before are now gone. So what did the slave rebellion accomplish other than costing people their lives? It caused the black people to be treated even worse than they were before the rebellion. In New York City, here again, we only know what the white people tell us. They said that there was a series of fires, and there was rumors of a planned slave rebellion, and they were going to take over the city of New York and turn it over to the Spanish. And I'm sorry, I have trouble with that one. I know that when people are afraid, they're going to believe some ridiculous stories, but can you think about that for a minute? Think about the location of New York. Think about the location of Spanish Florida. Uh, of course, these people were not all that great on geographic knowledge, I must admit. They were just terrified of the slaves rebelling and terrified of the Spanish taking over and didn't think it through. Uh, there weren't that many blacks in New York City. They were outnumbered like 100 to 1 by whites. I mean, it's ridiculous. Was there a series of fires? Yes. Accidental or planned? I don't know. But we do know 150 blacks and whites were arrested. 34 people were executed, and 4 of them were white for this rebellion. Like I said, we don't know the people who were involved, didn't write anything. All we have is there was a series of fires and rumors. So let's leave slavery and riots and fires for a few minutes. Liberty. We all have our own meaning in our mind of what liberty means to us. But to the British in the 1700s and 1600s, it meant more than the privileges you had from your social class. It was defined as the right to resist arbitrary government. And liberty had 2 basic central sets of ideas. We're going to call them republicanism and liberalism. And republicanism, they believed that only citizens who owned property and were willing to subordinate themselves, their self-interest to the common good, enjoyed liberty. That's the only way you could enjoy liberty, was to put yourself behind the good of the whole. Now, this idea is resounding in the colonies. It's called public virtue in the colonies. Now, liberalism, which has a different meaning today, but John Locke, the leading British philosopher, he argued that governments were made through a social contract in which we, the citizen, turn over parts of our right to govern ourselves to the government, as long as the government doesn't interfere in our religion and our family or our economic life. Well, that makes sense. I'm busy making a living. I'm busy out here killing Indians and building houses. I haven't got time to govern. I'll let you govern. Just don't get in my face. And he also goes so far as to say that the governed, which is you and me, we have the right to rebel if the government is unjust. Although I don't think he said rebel. I think he said resist or replace. And no matter whether you say rebel, resist, or replace, you're talking treason. Now this is John Locke. And does this look like a man who's going to advocate rebellion? He looks to me like a aristocrat who's got other things on his mind than liberties and freedoms. But then appearances can be deceiving. Now a little bit of background. In a lot of ways, the British colonies were much more democratic than the mother country. And the qualifications for voting were pretty much the same. You had to be male and you had to own property. And of course, women, children, slaves, and Indians couldn't vote. But in the New World, the ownership of the land was a much larger percentage than in Europe. And in some places, even free blacks could vote. And some colonies demanded you belong to the right church, but that's no big deal. You can join a church and then go vote. So we've got a much larger group of people able to vote. White males could vote. And because of things that are going on in their government and their arguments with other countries, Great Britain, our mother country, is kind of ignoring it. She's kind of leaving us alone. And this is going to be fine because we're becoming very independent and our local elected assemblies are beginning to govern and they're getting very independent. We all are. So England passes what we call the trade and navigation laws, which are basically just import and export duties. But if you ever looked at the coastline on our East Coast, yes, you've got those big ports of Boston and Charleston, but they've got thousands and thousands of little coves, and you don't have to pull into a port to unload your ship. So if you don't like the law or you don't like the custom or the taxes being charged, unload it somewhere else. In other words, you're smuggling. So if we didn't like the laws, we just ignored them. But meanwhile, we're growing and we're prosperous and we've got good relations with our mother country and everything seems to be pretty much hunky-dory right now. I mean, what more can you ask? We're Englishmen. Let's back up just a little bit. Those really religious people in New England, the Puritans and the Pilgrims, they believed everything was God's will and everything was predestined. So if we're having problems with our Indians and the Indians are getting very testy about the white man taking their land, it's God's punishment. So between 1691 and 1692, we had witch scare in Salem. And it wasn't just here. As a matter of fact, we even had a witch burning in Kentucky about this time. Anything you don't understand, you're scared of. Now, Reverend Samuel Parris had daughters. Okay, let's stop here just a minute. When my children were young, in the summertime, I mean, we had television, we had bicycles, we had radios, we had games. I mean, there was all kinds of things to keep them busy, but they did get bored. So can you imagine what a preteen would be like living in 1690? She has nothing but a book to read, maybe one book if she's lucky, and housework to do. What else is there to do? Well, Reverend Samuel Parris had a slave that was from the islands, and Tabitha was her name, and she would take these girls out into the woods and tell them stories about the voodoo and stuff going on in the islands. Oh, they thought this was just great. She regaled them with all kinds of stories, and they loved having her go with them out in the woods and talk. And of course, Mama wasn't always sure what they're talking about, but you know, they're out of her way. Then all of a sudden, one morning, these girls started crawling around on the floor on their hands and knees and barking like a dog. Well, the mother was, of course, very alarmed, so she sent for the doctor immediately. The doctor comes in and examines them. They couldn't find anything wrong with the girls. He says, it's out of my purview. There's nothing physically wrong with these girls. It must be something spiritual. So they called the minister. And the minister diagnosed them as being under the spell of witchcraft. And you can't explain anything through the normal ways. It's something you don't understand, so it has to be witchcraft. Well, when the girls were asked how did this happen, who put the spell on them, what were they doing, they started accusing other people. Now, back in the day, all you had to do to accuse a witch was if they had warts or they had strange behavior, or if after you walked by my house, my cow got sick or my chicken stopped laying, I could accuse you of witchcraft. Or I could say, I saw you fly on a broomstick, and they would believe me. I mean, why would I say it if it wasn't true? Or, of course, if you confess that you were a witch. And, of course, one of the ways to tell is, you can't say the Lord's Prayer. Other people are testifying against you. You've got warts, a little bit of, something that's a little bit out of the normal. You're considered a witch. The girls kept accusing, and eventually hundreds were arrested because they were accused of being witches, and 19 were actually hung as a witch, and one gentleman was pressed to death. I mean, they kept putting more and more weights on his chest, trying to get him to admit that he was a warlock, and he wouldn't do it. And the irony is, if you admit you were a witch, you probably would be okay, but if you denied it, you could be executed. It's kind of like the old trial by contest. I mean, we're going to put this witch in a chair and dip her in the water, and if she floats, she's a witch and we'll hang her. If she drowns, she's innocent and we'll forgive her. It's a no-win situation. But the girls kept accusing people all over the place and getting into the next villages. And finally, after a year, they're still accusing people, and people are having going on trial, and they accused the governor's wife. And the governor said, that's it. So he ends the witch trials, and he orders everybody in jail to be freed. And the girls stopped having visions, and the witch scare passed. So the common, general accepted term is that the reverend's wife got hold of some meal or flour that was contaminated in some way with hallucinogenic, and the girls were hallucinating. Another theory is that the girls were bored and were just trying to play jokes on their parents, and when they saw the reaction they got, they liked it, so they kept it up. Another thing was said when maybe they really were witches there. You never know. But one thing I will mention to you, and this is strictly circumstantial, and I'm not saying it happened, I'm just saying all the 19 people that were hung for witchcraft, it had problems with the government of Salem over land. I'm sure it had nothing to do with it. But of course, the judges at the witch trials were the officials of Salem. I think you say, I will leave it up to you to make the decision what you believe it was. Okay, let's get into the good stuff. The Imperial Rivalries. Now, France and Spain are big countries. France and Spain and England are the countries in Europe, and they all own land or claim land here in the New World. Now, France and Spain, their territory they're claiming is very, very large, but they have a very small population, and they're not very economically developed. And the Spanish Empire, as I said, it stretches from the Pacific coast to New Mexico and to the Great Plains into Texas and Florida. They had a few outposts, and they tried to reinvigorate their colonies, but it just didn't work. But Russia is coming on the scene, and she's starting to fish just off the Alaskan coast and down the coast of the east or the west side of Canada and coming on down into the New World. And Spain doesn't like this. So she's afraid that she's going to come down too far, so she starts settling California wholeheartedly and with missions and presidios. But the problem is she did the same thing that the other Europeans did. They bring diseases. And trying to resettle the Indians, they devastated the population. It just was a lose-lose scenario. Now this map, basically, the lavender, which happens to be my favorite color, but all this land, all the lavender is what France is claiming. Now, this, of course, is the Gulf of Mexico, and there's New Orleans. But all the way over to the mountain range, the Cumberland Mountains. I mean, yeah, she's just claiming an unreal amount of land. The pink, of course, is what Spain is claiming. This little green right here, little bit of green hugging the coast. That's all that England's claiming. Looks kind of lopsided, doesn't it? The three major powers in Europe, but then England's a little pretentious island anyway. The French are claiming all of known Canada, all the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. But England is claiming the land from the Pacific to the Atlantic. France has actually placed Iron Place on the upper end of the Ohio River in eastern Kentucky, claiming it for France. Let's go back and look at that just a minute again. Okay. Here you've got New Orleans. Here you've got the Mississippi River goes up. So that anything on either side of the Mississippi River is considered the Mississippi River Valley. And coming off of the Mississippi River, you've got the Ohio River going up this way, up to what we call Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Whoops. Anyway, you've got two countries claiming the same area of land. Not good. The English governor of Virginia, a man named Robert Dimwittle. And no, you don't have to remember his name. I just like saying Dimwittle. He doesn't like the idea that the French are on the land claimed by England, so he's going to send an envoy up into Canada to talk to them and tell them to get their French butts out. Now, the English militia, or excuse me, the colonial militia, has a very bad reputation. In all honesty, it's deserved. They have this reputation for shooting once and running. Excuse me, strategically retreating. But when you get right down to it, they have not been trained as a militia. They have not been trained as a military force. They're shopkeepers. They're bakers. They're apothecaries. They show up once a month at the local tavern and have a few beers and take a few shots at a target. Now, yes, if the Indians attack, they'd shoot at the Indians. But if they're not a trained military. But the Canadian militia is trained. The French have trained them like they would a military unit. So the French have absolutely no respect or use for the colonial militia. So when this colonial militia officer shows up, they start not to even receive him, but they finally did. And he did look good in his blue uniform and his blue eyes and his powder white hair. They received him not because he was an officer in the militia. They received him because he was a rich, educated, well-respected plantation owner from Virginia by the name of George Washington. Well, they received him and they had tea and they told him very politely that they weren't going anywhere. So dear old George goes back to Virginia and tells the governor, you know, they're not going anywhere. So the governor sends George with a group of men out to go up the Ohio River to the area at the headwaters and to build a fort, not knowing that the French already had a fort being built there called Fort Duquesne. Well, it was a disaster. George ended up building a fort called Fort Necessity, and he had no military experience. He received his commission in the militia because of his position as a planter, not because of any knowledge of the military. But this particular expedition was a total disaster. The French attacked and he lost. He had to surrender and he came back to Virginia saying, hey, you know, the French are not going anywhere. They've got this fort up at the headwaters of the Ohio River, and they basically kicked the colonial butt. So the governor sends to England for some experienced military people. And before you know it, a well experienced and toughened, hard headed general shows up. And George and the rest of them tried to explain to them that even though he had several thousand trained British troops, it wasn't going to work because the British fought European style and the French had just taken on the Indian style, whereas the English would, the first row of soldiers would fire and kneel down and reload. The people behind them would fire, then they'd kneel down and reload, and the people behind them would fire and then kneel down and reload. And whoever had the most soldiers still standing at the end of the battle won the battle. But the French had taken on the Indian style of fighting, where they would stand behind a tree and fight, and then run behind another bush and shoot, and then run behind another tree and shoot, and you never knew where they were going to be. They didn't stand in a line and shoot. Well, General Braddock was told this, but he wouldn't listen. So Braddock and Washington was assigned to him, and they were going to go up the Ohio River. Now, I did have if you get a chance to go online YouTube, there's several good videos on about the General Braddock and his defeat. He had several thousand trained soldiers wearing bright red coats marching in a line. Out in front of them was the bagpipes playing. And then behind them were the people chopping down trees to build a road. And then behind them with the wagons full of stuff that the general would need to be accommodated. I mean, you could hear them coming for 5 miles. There was no way they were going to surprise the French. Well, the French, of course, learned that they were coming, and they're outnumbered 2-1. They don't have the cannon at the fort that they're supposed to have, so they decide the best thing to do is to abandon the fort. But they're going to have some fun before they do, so they send out the few Indians they've got and the few French militia they've got to harass them. Well, Braddock sends out his men in a single file through the woods wearing bright red uniforms, and on each side of them are the few dozen French, and they're picking them off right and left. They killed over 800 of them. And the general. Washington kept asking the general, let us fight like the French are fighting behind, trees. And the general said, no, that's not the right thing to do. That's not the gentlemanly thing to do. So when the general was killed, Washington took over and managed to get people back out. So it was a bad defeat. It's called Braddock's defeat. So you have the first 2 battles of this war, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, were total disasters. The result of bad decisions. And just for 2 years, it's one failure after another. And finally, we get a new prime minister in England. He changes the strategy of the British in the New World, and they started winning battles. But it lasted almost 8 years, back and forth. In 1760, King George II dies, and his grandson takes over, King George III. Aha, King George III. And he says, enough is enough. End it. So even though he said ended in 1760 and the fighting basically stopped pretty much at that point in time, the treaty wasn't signed until 1763, the Treaty of Paris. And I've got remembered that date. 1763 is the magic high water mark of the end of good relations between the colonists and England. In the past, in the wars, it seemed like when the war was over, everything went back the way it was. But not this time. This time, England forced France to leave North America totally. So England got all of known Canada. She got everything east of the Mississippi River, including Spanish Florida. Wait a minute, the Spanish owned Florida. How'd this happen? Okay. There were no Spanish soldiers here. There were no Spanish battles. There were no Spanish ships. But Spain and France are allies. So if France lost the war, her ally lost the war too. So we took Spanish Florida. But I think we got to feel a little bit bad about it if you want to know the truth. And we got to looking at all that land, and all that land west of the Ohio River. Technically, it should have gone to England, but how are they going to manage it? So what we did is we kicked the French totally out of North America, which means they had to leave their little colony of New Orleans. So we made the Spanish give us Florida, and we gave the Spanish New Orleans. That's very confusing, isn't it? Yes, yes it is. Now, eventually the Spanish are going to get Florida back, but you've got people from the islands coming in, you've got the French settling in New Orleans, you've got Spanish are now taking over New Orleans, and eventually the French are going to take it back. This is why you have such a Duke's mixture of cultures in New Orleans, because it's gone back and forth between countries so much of the time. Okay, the war's over, the treaty's been signed, and the English declare something called the Proclamation Line of 1763. I think I've got it. Let's see if I got it. Yeah, here it is. Everything east of the Mississippi is going to belong, and all of this belongs to England. I mean, it's a heck of a bunch of land. But the English declared this Appalachian Mountains something called the Proclamation of 1763. Now, what this is doing, they need to organize and decide how are they going to rule Canada. I mean, Canada was French. Are they going to make all the French people get out or become English? I mean, what are they going to do? What about all the fur trade in this area, the Ohio River Valley? What about all that fur trade? How are we going to raise money to pay for this war that lasted so long? And what about the Indians? Now, the English had been nice to the Indians because they didn't want them to be all allies of the French. But what if the Indians get really upset now that the French are gone? And that's what's going to happen. There's going to be an Indian named Pontiac who's going to lead a rebellion within 2 years after, which he finally dawns on the French are gone. It was a very bloody battle. Of course, as a foregone conclusion, the English were going to win. But the French being gone, the English no longer have to be nice. And the English really didn't want to have to be war with the Indians. So this is part of it's to pacify them. So they made this demand, and you could no longer buy land from the Indians. You could no longer sell anything to the Indians. And if you lived west of that line, you had to get your butts back on the other side. Well, this makes all the land speculators in the colonies very upset because all that land out there, they wanted part of it. The Pennsylvania Indians and the Pennsylvanians, well, they're not doing too well. And the old Quaker elite, their rule is totally shattered, and their policy of accommodating the Indians is now shot. No more. A group of Pennsylvanians called the Paxton Boys actually marched on Philadelphia demanding more support to kill Indians. And they went back, killed every Indian they could find, even peaceful Indians that didn't cause them any problems. If they were an Indian, they were killed. The excuse being the only good Indian is a dead Indian. But one thing about this war, now, there were times when especially the people in New England, they had to be, shall we say, persuaded to join the fight. They said it's Britain's fight, it's not ours. And sometimes they even traded with the French. Those New England Yankee traders are out for the buck. And before we had 13 self-contained little countries, and even though several of their founding fathers had tried to get the colonies to unite, it had not worked. Everybody wanted to be their own boss. But this war seemed to unite us and prove to us how great it was to be British. We're 13 colonies, but we're 13 British colonies. And we have this sense of identity, and we didn't have this before the war. And now, in a way, we feel a bit unified, and in some ways, like, you know, the French are gone, the Spanish are gone. Do we really need all this heavy-handed stuff from England? So when she starts with all these new laws and new taxes, we're going to have some problems. Now, I did not go into the Great Awakening, and I only briefly touched on this section on the public sphere. So you do need to make sure you read those sections, because in the very next chapter, we're going to begin the American Revolution. Now, as I said, I have not covered everything in the chapter, but I've covered the highlights. And you do need to read the chapters. And if there's something specific you need to spend some time on, like the Great Awakening, the public sphere, I will point it out to you. That being said, we're going to end chapter 4.